Welcome back for another of George MacDonald's Unspoken Sermons. It's been far too long since our last sermon, and I apologize for that. But we're going to jump right back in where we left off and start talking about a sermon that's titled The Last Farthing. And MacDonald begins this sermon with a quote from Matthew 5:26, but I want to give you a little bit more context to the verse than he provides, because he'll be alluding to it later on. And so let me look it up in here real fast, and I will read it more thoroughly. It's Jesus talking just after the Beatitudes, and he's already talked about how we are not supposed to be angry with one another, and he goes on to say this in Matthew 5:25. He says, "Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him. Or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison." And then we get to the verse that MacDonald uses, and he says, "Truly I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny." Or, in the case of MacDonald's edition, it says, "Verily I say unto thee, thou shalt by no means come out thence, till thou have paid the last farthing," if you prefer that. But MacDonald starts with talking about parables, and he talks about this as though it's a parable, and it makes sense. It's a kind of a short snippet of a narrative that is meant to illustrate a deeper principle, although it's not quite as fancy as some of the other parables that we're familiar with. Of parables, he says, "There is a thing wonderful and admirable in the parables, not readily grasped, but specially indicated by the Lord himself. Their unintelligibility to the mere intellect. They are addressed to the conscience, not to the intellect, to the will, and not to the imagination. They are not meant to explain anything, but to rouse a man to the feeling, I am not what I ought to be. I do not the thing I ought to do." And I have to stop there, because the wording that he just used, where the person who's reading the parable feels that they are not what they ought to be and that they're not doing what they ought to do, is the exact feeling that I had when I closed Phantastes by George MacDonald for the first time. It's a fairy tale for men and women that is rather confusing for my intellect, at least, trying to trace all the different adventures that this person was having and what we're supposed to glean from them. And so when I closed the book for the first time, I literally said in my mind, I have no idea what that book was about, but I want to be a better person because of it. And so what MacDonald is talking about being the case of parables, where they're maybe confusing to our minds but not to our hearts, is also true of the stories that he himself writes, which I think is lovely. But continuing on, he says that there's a danger to just trying to interpret things and use our intellect too heavily when we're looking into parables. He says, "Many maundering interpretations may be given by the wise, with plentiful loss of labor, while the child who uses them for the necessity of walking in the one path will constantly receive light from them. The greatest obscuration of the words of the Lord, as of all true teachers, comes from those who give themselves to interpret rather than do them. Theologians have done more to hide the gospel of Christ than any of its adversaries." Theologians have done more to hide the gospel of Christ than any of its adversaries. "It is not for our understanding, but our will, that Christ came. He who does that which he sees shall understand. He who is set upon understanding rather than doing shall go on stumbling and mistaking and speaking foolishness." And that's, I think, a pretty apt description of me for a number of years, trying too hard to understand things instead of just acting the way I know I'm supposed to act. But in further support of this notion, he says, let's just look at what Jesus said. Let us try to understand what the Lord himself said about his parables. And then he goes on to say that he thinks Matthew 13:14-15 is maybe the best description that he gives, although he says similar descriptions appear in all the other Gospels and elsewhere, but he thinks that Matthew's is the most thoroughly fleshed out version of it. So in this one, he says, I'm going to start with verse 13 though. He says, "The reason I speak to them in parables," this is Jesus again, "the reason I speak to them in parables is that, seeing, they do not perceive, and hearing, they do not listen, nor do they understand. With them indeed is fulfilled a prophecy of Isaiah that says, 'You will indeed listen, but never understand. You will indeed look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes, so that they might not look with their eyes, and listen with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them.'" So he's saying that if we just look with our intellect, we won't perceive the deeper meaning of the parables. We have to actually go and do the things that they're implying we should do. And MacDonald continues on saying that this will help remove the difficulty that the parables are plainly for the teaching of the truth, and yet the Lord speaks of them as for the concealing of it. They are for the understanding of that man who is practical, who does the thing he knows, who seeks to understand vitally. They reveal to the live conscience, otherwise not to the keenest intellect, though at the same time they may help to rouse the conscience with glimpses of the truth, where the man is on the borders of waking. In reference to the people who are just trying to digest instead of to do, he says that to say to them certain things so that they could understand them would but harden them more, because they would not do them. They should have but parables, lanterns of the truth, clear to those that will walk in their light, dark to those who will not. The former are content to have the light cast upon their way. The latter will have it in their eyes. I think that's a lovely illustration, and kind of similar to Lewis's and I think Chesterton's analogy of saying that they believe in Christianity or in Jesus as they do the sun, not because they see it per se, because it's blinding, but rather they see everything else more clearly because of it. So the people who want to understand everything before they do it are the ones who will have the lantern in their eyes and therefore be blinded and paralyzed. But those who will be content to have it upon their path and just live it out are the ones who will make progress. But let's take a look at the parable that we started with, the one about paying the last farthing, and see what action MacDonald thinks is calling us to. He says, "The parable is an appeal to the common sense of those that hear it, in regard to every affair of righteousness. Arrange what claim lies against you. Compulsion waits behind it." Compulsion waits behind it. Because if we don't settle our affairs with the person who accused us on our way to court, then we might get thrown in prison and have to settle our affairs with them anyway while we're in prison. So why not just skip over the middleman of prison and just do right by our accuser right away? He says, "Do at once what you must do one day, as there is no escape from payment. Escape at least the prison that will enforce it. Do not drive justice to extremities. Duty is imperative. It must be done." So justice will be done either way, so don't drive it to the extremities of having to force you to do justice. Do it because it's right. And he says that to some people, the idea of having to pay the last farthing and therefore do right by the person who was accusing you sounds like a terrible threat. It sounds ominous. But to others, he says, it sounds like a hopeful promise that they're going to be made right. He says, "To the honest man, to the man who would fain be honest, the word is of right gracious import." Gracious import. "To the untrue, it is a terrible threat. To him who is of the truth, it is sweet as most loving promise. What but the last farthing would those who love righteousness more than life pay? It is a joy profound as peace to know that God is determined upon such payment, is determined to have his children clean, clear, pure as very snow, is determined that not only shall they, with his help, make up for what wrong they have done, but at length be incapable, by external choice of good, under any temptation, of doing the thing that is not divine, the thing God would not do." And now MacDonald is going to change gears a little bit and start addressing what he sees as a heresy within the church, with regards to people being made righteous. And that's the notion that somehow through Christ's death, he has imparted onto us the benefits of his righteousness without us actually having to be made righteous ourselves. He says, "There has been much cherishing of the evil fancy, often without its taking formal shape, that there is some way of getting out of the region of strict justice, some mode of managing to escape doing all that is required of us. But there is no such escape. There is no heaven with a little of hell in it, no plan to retain this or that of the devil in our hearts or our pockets. Out Satan must go, every hair and feather. Neither shalt thou think to be delivered from the necessity of being good by being made good." God is the God of the animals in a far lovelier way, I suspect, than many of us care to think, but he will not be the God of a man by making a good beast of him. "Thou must be good. Neither death nor any admittance into good company will make thee good." And he goes on to say that this notion that he's speaking out against has been around for a while, it seems, because it looks like John is pointing it out in his gospel. He says, "It is apparently an old doctrine, for St. John seems to point at it where he says, 'Little children, let no man lead you astray. He that doeth righteousness is righteous, even as he is righteous.'" And then MacDonald continues, "Christ is our righteousness, not that we should escape punishment, still less escape being righteous, but as the live, potent creator of righteousness in us, so that we, with our wills receiving his Spirit, shall like him resist unto blood, striving against sin. Shall know in ourselves, as he knows, what a lovely thing is righteousness, what a mean, ugly, unnatural thing is unrighteousness. He is our righteousness, and that righteousness is no fiction, no pretense, no imputation." I think the most powerful portion there is when he says that Christ is our righteousness, not that we should escape punishment, still less escape being righteous. And I think what MacDonald is talking about in the church is the notion that we can not be righteous, but still be given the benefits of righteousness. And so he says that's not going to fly. But he's still pointing to Christ as the source of our righteousness. Just, he's not saying that we can do whatever we want and then be considered righteous because of Christ. He says we still have to be made righteous. And it is Christ who kind of shows us how to be that, so that like him we can resist unto blood, striving against sin. And he goes on to say that any system that tends to persuade men that there is any salvation but that of becoming righteous even as Jesus is righteous, that a man can be made good as a good dog is good, without his own willed share in the making, that a man is saved by having his sins hidden under a robe of imputed righteousness, that system, so far as this tendency, is of the devil and not of God. So I thought I should maybe add one extra tidbit here, in case you were perhaps bothered by how MacDonald portrays Christ's role in salvation. I thought I'd just point out something in Mere Christianity where C.S. Lewis is trying to describe what all Christians agree upon, irrespective of their different denominations and such. So like what is the core tenets, what are the core tenets of Christianity? And then one of his chapters called The Perfect Penitent, he just says something short, but I think helpful in this context. He says, "The central Christian belief is that Christ's death has somehow put us right with God and given us a fresh start. Theories as to how it did this are another matter." And I think that, though I'm pretty sure Lewis maybe disagreed with MacDonald and his interpretation of things, I feel that MacDonald's description would still fall in line with Christ, like his death putting us right. So I don't know, thought I'd throw it out there in case it's helpful. Maybe this is one of MacDonald's theories as to how this happened. And those are, as he says later, secondary issues and not important really, per se. They're quite secondary. Mere plans or diagrams to be left alone if they do not help us. And even if they do help us, not to be confused with the thing itself, he says in a little bit. I don't know, maybe that softened the blow a bit. It's funny because when people hear that MacDonald is a universalist and thinks that everyone is going to ultimately go to heaven, they sometimes think that he's maybe being unreasonably gracious and not actually being just. But then when they see him say stuff like this, saying that we have to actually be righteous and not have our sins hidden under a robe of imputed righteousness, they would say he's being too legalistic. And what is fun is that he's actually packaging all of these seemingly extreme views under an overarching blanket of goodness and grace even. Because in MacDonald's eyes, punishment is only there for the betterment of the person. So MacDonald comes back around to the topic of this particular parable and says, I read then in this parable that a man had better make up his mind to be righteous, to be fair, to do what he can to pay what he owes in any and all relations of life. All the matters, in a word, wherein one may demand of another or complain that he has not received fair play. Arrange your matters with those who have anything against you while you are yet together, and things have not gone too far to be arranged. You will have to do it, eventually, is what he's implying. And now MacDonald does what he loves to do, and has an imagined objector come in and say, hey now, wait a minute, in my situation, I'm actually in the right. This person who's complaining about me and wanting to take me to court is wrong, and so I shouldn't give him anything. Like, why would I give him anything? That would be wrong, wouldn't it? And MacDonald has to ask him if he loves this person like himself, and he has to say he doesn't. And then MacDonald says because of that, he can't trust his own opinions, essentially. He says, then no one is to be trusted when he thinks, however firmly, that he is all right and his neighbor all wrong in any matter between them. The guy continues to object, saying, but I don't say I am all right and he is all wrong. There may be something to urge on his side. What I say is that I am more in the right than he. MacDonald responds, let it be with the individual dispute as it may. You owe him something that you do not pay him. As certainly as you think he owes you something, he will not pay you. In other words, you owe him love, whether or not he owes you anything else. And to this, the guy says, he would take immediate advantage of me if I owned that. So much the worse for him. Until you are fair to him, it does not matter to you whether he is unfair to you or not. I beg your pardon, it is just what does matter. I want nothing but my rights. What can matter to me more than my rights? Your duties, your debts, MacDonald says. And this claiming of rights is something that I think comes up very strongly in The Great Divorce, where you have a ghost who says he's done very well all his life, like trying to be good. He wasn't a religious person, but he's tried to be good all his life. And so why would he find a murderer in heaven, which he does, and when he's been stuck in hell for so long? But it's interesting that despite the very similar sounding language of someone just claiming their rights, and that's all they want is their rights, MacDonald and Lewis take different tacks on what that looks like, I think. But in both cases, it is a sort of pride that pulls us into ourselves and out of community. So if someone steals your watch, you might have a right to have that person prosecuted, but maybe you have a duty to forgive them, and maybe even not have them prosecuted. Or maybe you forgive them and still have them prosecuted. But MacDonald's saying that until you do right by them, it doesn't matter whether or not they're right by you. Now, that watch example is actually one that MacDonald gives in another sermon for another purpose, but here he uses money as an example. He says, if you owe him £1 and he you £1,000,000, you must pay him the £1 whether he pay you the $1,000,000 or not. There is no business parallel here. If, owing you love, he gives you hate, you, owing him love, have yet to pay it. A love unpaid you, a justice undone you, a praise withheld from you, a judgment passed on you without judgment, will not absolve you of a debt of a love unpaid, a justice not done, a praise withheld, a false judgment passed. You must pay him whether he pay you or not. And he says it's exactly the same between us and God. He said the same holds with every demand of God. By refusing to pay, the man makes an adversary who will compel him, and that for the man's own sake. This reminds me of the quote from another sermon where he's saying something to the effect of God is against sin, your sin, and therefore he's for you. But it may not always feel pleasant when he's against your sin. He continues saying, if you or your life say, I will not, then he will see to it. There is a prison, and the one thing we know about that prison is that its doors do not open until entire satisfaction is rendered, the last farthing paid. Whatever in us can be or make an adversary, whatever could prevent us from doing the will of God or from agreeing with our fellow, all must be yielded. But what happens if we don't yield everything? He says, if the man denies the debt or acknowledging does nothing towards paying it, then at last the prison. God in the dark can make a man thirst for the light, who never in the light sought but the dark. And so now we transition into MacDonald's image of hell, essentially. So let's see what MacDonald's hell looks like. He says, I think I have seen from afar something of the final prison of all, the innermost cell of the debtor of the universe. I will endeavor to convey what I think it may be. It is the vast outside, the ghastly dark beyond the gates of the city of which God is the light, where the evil dogs go ranging, silent as the dark, for there is no sound any more than sight. The time of signs is over. Every sense has its signs, and they were all misused. There is no sense, no sign more, nothing now by means of which to believe. The man wakes from the final struggle of death in absolute loneliness. Such a loneliness as in the most miserable moment of deserted childhood he never knew. Not a hint, not a shadow of anything outside his consciousness reaches him. In the midst of the live world, he cared for nothing but himself. Now in the dead world, he is in God's prison, his own separated self. He would not believe in God because he never saw God. Now he doubts if there be such a thing as the face of man, doubts if ever he really saw one. So he's describing the dungeon of ourselves, a hell that we can be in now or after we've died as well. And this goes back to Paradise Lost, of course, with whither I fly am hell, myself am hell. Now MacDonald goes on here to describe kind of the psychological stages that the man would go through after he got into hell. But I'll just say what he says here. He says, the most frightful idea of what could, to his own consciousness, befall a man is that he should have to lead an existence with which God had nothing to do. And he says that out of sheer loneliness, the man would welcome the sight of any other living creature. He says, in such evil case, I believe the man would be glad to come into contact with the worst loathed insect. It would be a shape of life, something beyond and beside his own huge, void, formless being. I imagine some such feeling in the prayer of the devils for leave to go into the swine. His worst enemy, could he but be aware of him, he would be ready to worship. Without the correction, the reflection, the support of other presences, being is not merely unsafe, it is a horror. Without the correction, reflection, and support of other presences, being is not merely unsafe, it is a horror. And this makes me think of Chesterton in Orthodoxy saying, I think it was Orthodoxy, saying that to think in isolation leads to arrogance, if I remember him correctly. And then it says, if we will not have softening of the heart, we will ultimately have softening of the brain. And sure enough, MacDonald says that unless God pulls us out of the dungeon of ourself, we would ultimately go insane, essentially. And eventually, he says, wish for annihilation. He says, the man who minds only himself must at last go mad if God did not interfere. Can there be any way out of the misery? Will the soul that could not believe in God, with all his lovely world around testifying of him, believe when shut in the prison of its own lonely, weary all and nothing? It would for a time try to believe that it was indeed nothing, a mere glow of the setting sun on a cloud of dust, a paltry dream that dreamed itself. Oh, that's nice. It seems like the imagery he gives for materialism with regards to nature without God being just chaos dreaming, and people having consciousness just being random atoms moving around, being chaos dreaming. And then he says, if only the dream might dream that it was no more. That would be the one thing to hope for. But, he says, there must be hope while there is existence. For where there is existence, there must be God, and God is forever good, nor can be other than good. But alas, the distance from the light! Such a soul is at the farthest verge of life's negation. No, not the farthest. A man is nearer heaven when in deepest hell than just ere he begins to reap the reward of his doings. For he is of the condition to receive the smallest show of life that is, as a boon unspeakable. Not that he would think of God, it takes long to think of God, but hope would begin to dawn in his bosom, and the thinner darkness would be as a cave of light, a refuge from the horrid self of which he used to be so proud. And to conclude this section, MacDonald says, a man may well imagine it impossible ever to think so unpleasantly of himself, but he has only to let things go, and he will make it the real, right, natural way to think of himself. True, all I have been saying is imaginary, keep that in mind, but our imagination is made to mirror truth. So he's like, this is just something he's thinking of, but it seems like it's accurate. And to conclude this sermon, MacDonald imagines a long journey ahead of this person who's being pulled out of the dungeon of themselves, the hell of themselves. He says, so might I imagine 1,000 steps up from the darkness, each a little less dark, a little nearer the light. But the weary way. He cannot come out until he have paid the uttermost farthing. To the heart of God he must set out and go, or the last glimmer of humanity will die from him. Whoever will live must cease to be a slave and become a child of God. Be they few or many cast into such prison as I have endeavored to imagine, there can be no deliverance for human soul, whether in that prison or out of it, but in paying the last farthing, and becoming lowly, penitent, self-refusing, so receiving the sonship and learning to cry, Father. And that takes us into the verse for our next sermon, which I hope to do soon. Anyway, see you next time. I need to turn the heater back on and stoke this fire. I turned the heater off and the fridge off too for these videos so they're not making annoying sounds in the background. And sometimes I forget to turn them back on, but it's pretty cold outside and I don't want my pipes freezing, so I can't forget this time. Cheers. It seems Bob is less interested in MacDonald than I am. Let's see about Chubby. Oh, what a Chubby. Did you have a nice nap?